Wonderful. We are live at the last session of the EU-India People's Summit. Welcome to this incredibly diverse event that we have as the last one, where we're covering several time zones and are positioning this to really get diverse perspectives from people around the world on a topic that's close to the Indian diaspora, which is Hindutva. And that countering Hindutva doesn't mean hating Hinduism or being against India, but that it's part and an integral identity of Hinduism. Throughout the EU-India People's Summit, we have been talking about core topics of the European Union and India collaboration, including climate change and economic policy and everything on that level. And therefore, this may seem a little out of place, but the idea is that we are creating a people's roadmap, a vision for the European Union and India that we will communicate to decision makers and let them know that this is what we think should be incorporated in a vision for EU-India collaboration, especially since today, May 8, 2021, Narendra Modi and the European Union had their official diplomatic summit in which India presented an image of itself to Europe, which is not the entire image, just as every person doesn't present the entire image. And therefore, this conversation we're having today will aim to make a more holistic picture. And I'm incredibly grateful that we have a partner here with us to put this together. And on this note, I give over to Nikhil. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elena. Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. My name is Nikhil, and I serve as Advocacy Director for Hindus for Human Rights. Thank you, everyone, for joining us for this panel on Hindus across the diaspora resisting Hindutva. We are really grateful to our partners at the London Story and the EU-India People Summit for putting on a fantastic series of events over the last week. On behalf of myself and all of our speakers, before we get started, we just want to offer our condolences and solace to everyone who has lost family members or loved ones or friends in the ongoing COVID crisis in India. And when we talk about the COVID crisis, a lot of the discussions have focused on government inefficiency and malintent. And when we talk about the Indian government, we also have to talk about its guiding ideology, which is a term called Hindutva or Hindu nationalism, and that's the topic of today's conversation. So just a little bit about our organization. Hindus for Human Rights is a US-based nonprofit, non-partisan organization that was founded in 2019. We advocate for pluralism and civil rights and human rights in both South Asia and North America. And we do this rooted in the values of our Hindu faith, peace, justice, and truth. And we provide a Hindu voice of resistance to caste, to Hindutva, Hindu nationalism, to racism, and all forms of bigotry and oppression. And so from the title of this panel, you know that we're going to be talking about Hindutva or Hindu nationalism. And in contrast to Hindu religious traditions, many of which go back many centuries, thousands of years, Hindutva is a very modern political ideology that began just around 100 years ago. Advocates of this ideology argue that in a country like India, which is 1/5 of the population not Hindu, that Indian identity should be and must be synonymous with Hindu identity, and that Muslims, Christians, other minorities can never truly belong in India as Indians unless they accept, a second-class citizen status and the supremacy of the Hindu population. And of course, Hindutva is very much on the rise and has the guiding party and the ruling party in India follows this ideology. But Hindutva as a political ideology has also made its presence felt in countries wherever the Indian diaspora has settled. And so we're really excited to have this panel where our speakers from many different countries that represent areas of the South Asian diaspora will be speaking about the impact of Hindutva in their own communities. So we will have about 45 minutes for a conversation with our panelists, and then we'll open it up to around 15 minutes or so of audience Q&A. So throughout this discussion, feel free to ask questions in the Q&A box, and we'll try to get to some of them in the Q&A portion. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our speakers for today. And as I introduce you, feel free to turn your video on. First, we have Shawintala Banwari from Holland. Shawintala is a Suriname Hindustani activist in Holland who is speaking out against Hindutva, institutional racism, and against Islamophobia in Holland and globally. She is a co-founder of the Solidarity Platform Holland and a member of Hindus for Human Rights. Next, we have Vagisha Agrawal from Canada. Vagisha is a labor organizer and a graduate student based in Canada. She is also a member of Hindus for Human Rights. Welcome, Vagisha. Next, we have Sravya Taripalli from the US. Sravya is a board member of Hindus for Human Rights, and she works on poverty alleviation in rural Oregon. We also have Brij Maharaj from South Africa. Brij Maharaj is a senior professor of geography at the University of KwaZulu-Natal in Durban, South Africa. He is the deputy president of the South African Hindu Mahasabha and former president of the Sri Sanatan Dharma Sabha of South Africa. And finally, we have Arjun Rena, who is a playwright, actor, teacher, and Kathakali dancer based in Australia. His original works for the theater have been performed extensively in India, in Australia, and around the world, and he is a member of Hindus for Human Rights Australia. Unfortunately, Arjun is not able to join us right now. He's with his family in India dealing with kind of the front lines of the COVID crisis. But we will play just a short video message that he was kind enough to record for us. So in just 1 second, I will share my screen. All right, can everyone see the video? Can I get a thumbs up? Okay, great.
My spending the last 35 years learning and performing Kathakali was an attempt to enrich my being with the practice and knowledge of another caste, the Nayars of Kerala. A warrior caste like the Kshatriyas of the north. When my father first saw me dancing Kathakali, he was very disturbed by the amount of labor I needed to do with my body. He suggested I take up instead Kudiyatam, where the Chakyar or Nambudri temple servant chants text more than warring with his body. I'm an actor, dancer, and storyteller working primarily solo. My play A Terrible Beauty is Born worked to bring attention to the condition of call center workers in Gurgaon, India. My play A Colonial, the Convict, and the Cockatoo is an Indian migrant's critical view of Australian history. In Hawking the Bard in the Heart of Darkness, I chronicle 19th century Indian migration to Australia and the conditions of the White Australia policy. My play, The Magic Hour, a messy mix of Shakespeare and Kathakali, which has as its presiding deity Krishna, begins with the Azan, the Islamic call to prayer. I began starting my show with the Azan after the Gujarat riots as a reminder of that terrible event. Whenever anyone
So that's just a little bit about Arjun's background, and we'll be playing a closing message from him as well. At this point, if all of the panelists could please turn on their videos. Great, so we'll get started with our discussion before moving to Q&A. So just to kick off our discussion, when we talk about the Hindu diaspora and Hindu diaspora communities, that can mean very, very different things depending on what country we're talking about. And so I just wanted you all to start with just a couple minutes overview of what does the Hindu community look like in your country? Sort of what are the different History is the types of organizational presence that's there on the ground. And then from there, we can move on to talking about the ways that these communities are being affected by Hindutva. So I'll open it up to whoever wants to go first.
I'm happy to go first. I'm a third generation descendant of indentured labor, very much like the Suriname story, etc. And in South Africa, it's a multicultural society, it's a multi-religious society, like most of the countries represented in this panel. And Hinduism started in the oral tradition by memory, etc. But I always say in the 21st century, we follow a scripture-based Hinduism. And I'll come back to the scripture and the implications for Hindutva, maybe later in the discussion. So in 1912, the South African Hindu Mahasabha was established. It's got no link with the Mahasabha in India. It's a very important point to make because especially my American colleagues, they often get confused. We have no link, no connection with the Mahasabha and don't follow their ideology, etc. It's very South African. So we draw our Hindu inspiration from India and the scriptures, spiritual stuff, etc. But our Hindu practices are rooted in our country, which is very different from Canada, US, Holland, and India. I think all of us live, adjust to our lived experiences and the challenges that we face, and we adapt and adjust in that context. And therefore, it's very difficult to apply a universalizing tendency to say this is an Hinduism and everyone will now follow it. Hinduism is very eclectic. We have all the major movements. We have ISKCON, or the Hare Krishna movement. We have the older grouping of the Sanatanists, to which I belong. But I'm very open. I work with the Arya Samaj movement very closely on an almost regular basis. We work with the Divine Life Society, the Ramakrishna Center, the Chinmaya Mission. Then we have linguistic groups, the Tamil Federation, the Hindi Shiksha Sangh, the Andhra Sabha, the Kathiawad Hindu Seva Samaj. These are the broad, we call them national macro movements. And under these organizations, there's hundreds of smaller groups, satsangs, temple organizations, etc. And we work in harmony with other faiths. This is very important. We are a minority faith. And we work with at different interfaith forums with the Muslims, the Christians, the Jews. The Christian is a dominant faith. For example, right now, there's a symbolic solidarity effort to support India with the COVID crisis. And we have Hindu bodies involved. We have an organization called the Gift of the Giver. This is an Islamic disaster relief agency. They're international. And no one is saying it's a Hindu affair, therefore, we should only Hindus get involved, etc. So overall, I think our Hinduism is actually driven by the focus on social justice, which all faiths focus on: social justice, support for the poor, reduction of inequality, holding those, to speak truth to power. After all, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, what's it about? Who should rule? It's politics. It's the just ruler. But I don't think you want a lecture like this from me. I'll stop there.
We'll definitely get into the politics soon, but thank you so much, Bridgie, for that. Anyone else want to jump in?
I can talk about the United States, where I'm from. And the patterns of immigration from India and the United States really started primarily after the 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act, where a lot of the restrictions on immigration from Asia were lifted. And so most Hindus and Indians who came to the United States came after 1965. And that composes the majority of Hindus living in the United States. But it's also important to recognize that there are many Hindus who did not come directly from India in this last 50 years or so. For example, we have a very large Guyanese Hindu community in the United States, and obviously many non-Indians who maybe adopted Hinduism later in life. So it's important to recognize all those different communities that make up our tradition. And I think because we're such a diverse country and we come from such diverse histories, Hinduism can look really different depending on what community you're in. So for example, if you're in a big city like New York or San Francisco, where there's a large Indian community, your Hinduism might look very similar to how it looks in India. You might go to temple on major holidays, and you might have these large, garbas or dandiyas and celebrations, things like that, at big festivals. I grew up in a relatively rural area where there's not a lot of Indians. So for us, it looked very different. Our nearest temple is 2 hours away. So we would have a lot of bhajans at people's houses, satsangs. And I think that gives a lot of people a chance to kind of reinvent Hindu traditions and look at them in a new way and reevaluate them and understand scripture at a deeper level, because we were kind of away from those, very rooted traditions. So that's kind of how it's looked for me and for a lot of people in the US.
Thanks, Rabia. Shamantal or Vagisha, do you want to go next?
Yeah, so I live in Holland, and over here most Hindus here in Holland, they don't come directly from India. Most of us are Suriname Hindustanis. So just as with South Africa, during the colonization era, that happened during the 19th century, many Indian families, they were being transported by the colonists from India to Suriname, to Trinidad, to South Africa, so to different parts of the world. And so for us, India is like 4 or maybe even 5 generations back. When our ancestors, when they left India, most of them, they decided to reject the caste system. There's also a book written about the Suriname Hindus and how they left India, and even before they entered Europe, before they entered Suriname, before they entered the West, they decided that they all were brothers and sisters. From an Indian perspective, many Indians like to tell that the Suriname Hindus and other Hindus from the Caribbean countries, that we were Dalits, that we were lower caste, and that was the reason why we actually rejected the caste system. But many recent scholars, they show that actually many Hindus from the Caribbean countries, they used to be Brahmins, they used to be from the upper caste, but the moment we left India, they decided to reject the caste system and that we all belong to each other. We're just brothers and sisters. So that is a main difference, I guess, between Suriname Hindus and Hindus from other diasporas, because I heard that in the UK and USA, many are still following the caste system. So that is why our Hinduism is very different. And I can see that there is, unfortunately, a lot of influence from Hindutva on the Suriname Hindustani diaspora. It already began, actually, I think, in the 80s or the 90s, because in that time, many Hindu Pandits from India, they traveled to Suriname. And from that moment, many Hindus started to believe that Islam came to India as a threat. They were being taught about stories about Muslims trying to invade India, Muslims trying to Islamize India. So from that moment, there was a start of Hindutva and Islamophobia among the Suriname Hindus. On the other hand, there were also Islamic people from Pakistan. They were telling the Muslims in Suriname that they shouldn't hang out with Hindus, that they shouldn't go to a temple or to Hindus' houses. So from that moment, there started to be a bit of tensions between the Hindus and Muslims in Suriname. But actually, I can see this.
We'll get into the Hindutva question in just a second. I want to just give Vagisha a chance to describe the Canadian community, and then we'll get very, very soon into that. Thank you.
Yeah. I'll just start by saying that I did spend half of my life in the Middle East, so like that's where I experienced the Hindu community the most. And then when I came to Canada, I did start to drift away from Hindu communities a little bit more. But the distinguishing factor about the Hindu diaspora here in Canada seems to me to be like how they distinguish themselves from the Sikh diaspora here in Canada. There are a lot of tensions, and they've been flaring up, especially given the farmer protests in India right now. And so, yeah, I mean, it's a very like the face of the Indian diaspora is like the Sikh community here in Canada. And so a lot of, and there's been a lot of influence of Hindutva, of course, on Hindu communities here, but they're not very politically prominent and very much, I would say, under the shadow of the Sikh communities here. Yeah, leave it at that.
Thanks, Vargisha. I think something that just hearing from all of you became very clear to me is that, you know, whenever we talk about Hindu communities, even in one country, let alone across the world, it's just so eclectic and so diverse. And I think, as we'll get into, like one of the real guiding forces of this Hindutva ideology is to homogenize all of that and to create like this one idea of what a Hindu should look like and behave and what they should eat and, you know, all of that. So leading into the next question then, we'd love to hear from each of you through a kind of concrete example. Can you tell us a little bit about how Hindutva is showing up in your country's Hindu community, whether in schools or local politics or temples, and how are people reacting to Hindutva? Are they pushing back, or are many people supportive? So I know Shawantala got started, but we can open up to anyone who wants to.
Go first again. On my screen, I seem to be first. I think it's linked to the B. At the outset, it's relatively insignificant in South Africa for several reasons. One, as I think, I don't have everyone's name, our colleague from Holland was saying, Shawantala, it's, you know, there's a disconnect. And in South Africa, the disconnect was quite strong because India was part of the, initiated the economic and cultural boycott of South Africa from 1946. And so after 1990, we really had no direct contact. There was some religious contact allowed with some spiritual leaders. And then we had Bollywood, which is, you know, depending where you're located, Bollywood is normally a weak connection, but it was very strong. So in 1990, we opened up to the world, we reconnected with India, etc. And just to give you a cultural dimension, if in 1990 you asked me what is paneer, I wouldn't know. It was only when the chefs started coming from India, etc., that you're now seeing, you know, different forms of cuisine, etc. Of course, you know, anywhere you see Indians, you'll find biryani. So we have that. But on the comeback to the Hindutva story, so in the early 90s, there were some suggestions that the Hindu Mahasabha should close down, you know, that South Africa is now a democratic country, all organizations are changing and the Mahasabha should close down. I was very young, I just finished my PhD, and basically I come from a, you know, I was part of the civic anti-apartheid movement. We were part of what is called the United Democratic Front, etc. With that kind of background, I actually decided that I want to put my energy into the faith sector to say how would we adjust and engage in a democratic society with a human rights-based constitution and project Hinduism that's adjusting to these types of changes, etc. And so when I was hearing about the closure of the organization, I began to ask questions. Why should we close it? What are we ashamed of? What have we done that's wrong? And then I picked up, there were clearly elements that had gone to India and had come back, and they were you know, talking about a new body. So in 1995, the World Hindu Congress was hosted in South Africa. The Mahasabha was not the host. It was actually imported by a few people. And then the organization, that conference began to collapse. Basically, they couldn't handle it. And a few people came to the Mahasabha to say, can we help them? And I was very critical. I said, who are you all? How do you bring the conference here? Of course, the senior leaders were saying, listen, from the Mahasabha, if the conference fails, it's an embarrassment to South Africa and our Hindus, etc. So there was a compromise. So we it's technically hosted the conference. But out of the conference, it was very clear that there was an agenda to actually shut the Mahasabha down and start a new body. And the new body was going to be called the Vishwa Hindu Parishad. That's what they're calling. So I don't have the time. I've written a little bit about it and I could share it with colleagues. So they began to talk about the VHP and I knew a little bit about it. So my title was the Public Relations Officer of the Mahasabha. So in the media, someone writes from the VHP saying Hindu organizations are Kumkarans. Now you will understand what the metaphor of Kumkaran means, and the Mahasabha is part of this Kumkaran and all the other organizations that I mentioned in the introduction, and they are now going to form a new body. So I drafted a response as a public relations, which was accepted by the Mahasabha executive and council. I must be honest, the Mahasabha has traditionally been very, it's conservative, which is the nature of, I think, most religious organizations. So I said, and I'll make a few points here very quickly. The VHP closely aligned with the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh. This organization was described as a sinister movement whose members drill in khaki uniform, salute the saffron flags. They stand for a Hindu and not a multi-religious India. Mahatma Gandhi's assassin, Nathuram Godse, was a member of the RSS. Now, given Gandhi's role in South Africa, that's a very emotional link. And then this is a very important point. I said the politics of India should not be imported to South Africa. The VHP is anti-Muslims. In South Africa, there's no conflict between Hindus, Muslims, and Christians, and there's no place for racial and religious bigots in South Africa. Progressive Hindus will not support organization like this. This was around 1996. I've got a date here. And so this organization, it existed, but it was largely invisible. It couldn't influence any national body. But over the past 3 or 4 years, there's been a resurgence of something called the World Hindu Foundation or World Hindu Federation. There's a Hindu Swayamsevak Sangh, and there's another body called the Hindu Dharma Association of South Africa. We really don't know much about these organizations. And oh yes, there's something called the Friends of India. I came in a lot of fire. They have been attacking me. That I do travel to India for conferences and other purposes, and I do enjoy it. And so I'm not actually. The Indian professors whom I work with will tell me that I'm more Hindu than they are. That's a very interesting point. But they threatened to ban me from going to India, that I won't get a visa, etc. I actually chatted to my friends in Delhi, and they said, listen, let that happen, then we'll make you into a global hero. They'll come and deliver the visa to your house. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Vijay. I think a few things to keep in mind are sort of these names of organizations: Vishwa Hindu Parishad, Hindu Swayamsevak Sangh, RSS. I'm sure many of these groups might be coming up in other conversations, but it really hints at this global network of Hindutva organizations, which may be rooted in India, but are very much trying to spread their influence. And it's great to hear that there was some pushback in South Africa, but these groups are on the rise in the last few years. So if any of our panelists who haven't spoken want to jump in and share, again, just a concrete example of how Hindutva has shown up in your country.
I can go if nobody else is going. Okay, so I mean, first of all, like Hindutva has really aided Islamophobia in Canada. 2 most recent examples would be last year, some Canadian cities said that they would allow the Islamic prayer call to be broadcasted during Ramadan, which generated a massive backlash, mostly from the Canadian far right, but they had been really, really emboldened, very publicly so, by the Hindu nationalists here. Or more recently, just as early as last month, or as recently as last month, groups like Canadian Hindu Advocacy, they've been harassing Sikh communities over here, protesting around gurudwaras everywhere for the farmer strikes in India, which are supposedly anti-national or whatever, and B, for being Khalistani, so just the classic Hindu nationalists, or sort of narrative that has completely penetrated cultural and religious spaces in Canada. And, you know, as concerning as that is, I mean, I definitely don't mean to minimize it when I say this. Like, I'm far more alarmed by Hindutva's presence in the political and economic arena. And I think the thing to keep in mind about that is that you don't have to be a Hindu, an Indian, or any of that to really aid Hindutva in India from like abroad, countries like Canada. So to look at a really pressing and current moment of Canada's like direct collaboration with India's Hindu nationalist government, we could look at Canada's active membership and deep involvement in the Cairns Group of Agriculture Exporters. So like here, I'll be quoting from the print, the newspaper, their coverage on Canada's position on the farmer protest. So this group, Cairns Group of Agriculture Exporters, their main objective in agriculture negotiations at the World Trade Organization has been to seek increased market access for their agri-exporters, particularly in large markets such as India. The Cairns group wants to enhance its market access in such countries by making them get rid of domestic agriculture subsidies that are provided to local producers, even at their subsistence level, right? So this is like Canada directly and consistently advocating to get rid of the minimum support price for crops in India, the very thing you know, that the farmers are afraid about, given those 3 farm bills, the very thing that they're protesting. So then on one hand, you have Justin Trudeau's Liberal government and his rhetorical defense of the farmers' right to protest. And on the other hand, his government's direct, like completely direct stake in their misery and in their like, you know, literal deaths. So I think to me that like really sheds light on the fact that Hindu nationalism is not merely an anti-Muslim or a Hindu supremacist project. Transnational big capital is benefiting from it for a reason. And the popularity of like the murderous ideas of the Hindu right are directly tied to material interests. And I'll leave it at that because I don't know how much time we have, but.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Vagisha. I think that's a really important point, that the collaborators with Hindutva groups are not always the, you know, white supremacists or other far-right individuals. It can also be people or individuals, organizations that we think of as so-called liberal, or and then that's a tactic that a lot of Hindutva groups is trying to fit in under that multicultural kind of framework. Shantala and Sravya, does one of you want to jump in?
Yes, like here in Holland, we have an far-right party. It's called PVV, and they are very anti-Islam and anti-Muslim. And according to a research, Hindustanis from different religions, they are more likely to vote for Wilders. There's still a very large minority voting for PVV, but yeah, unfortunately, they are more likely to vote on this Islamophobic party. And I think that this also because of the Hindu nationalism that reaches Holland. There are more Hindus, especially during the last 10 or 20 years, there are more Hindus who fall prone to the propaganda that Modi is spreading. And I know many Hindustani Islamic friends of mine. They get a lot of Islamophobic harassment from other Hindus. So yeah, it is very existent here in Holland. And also in many temples and many Hindu organizations, they are being financed by RSS and by other Hindutva organizations from India. And the thing is, these Hindu organizations in Holland, they pretend as if they are very liberal. For instance, there's a Hindu Pandit and the Hindu temple here in The Hague, and they pretend as if they stand for communal harmony and that they are against caste, but meantime, they are also spreading hatred against Islam. They want people to forbid the Quran. They really teach younger Hindus that Muslims and Islam are a threat. So I think that Hindus here in Holland, they are very easy fall prone to the Hindutva tactics, not just because of the influence from India, but also because here in the Dutch media there is a lot of Islamophobia, and so they are like being attacked by two sides, and the Dutch media is spreading false news on Islam, and the media in India. So yeah, that is a very big factor. And I also think that many Hindus, they want to be recognized by Indian Hindus for being Indian. I know many Suriname Hindustanis, they are being discriminated by Indian Hindus, but because many Indians think that we are not the real Indian, we are not Indian enough, or that Suriname Hindus are like not Hindu enough. And by supporting Modi, supporting BJP, many Suriname Hindus feel that they are still part of the Indian culture and that they are more likely being recognized by other Hindus from India. And on the other hand, I also want to say that there are more Hindus standing up against Hindutva. It's just not just me, but many Hindustani Facebook groups. There are more Hindus who are being angry at the Islamophobia that is very existent in our diaspora. I mean, another Hindu friend on Facebook, she started a campaign that we have to discuss nationalism with our families. We have to discuss, in particular, the Islamophobia with other Hindus, and that we have to stand up. So there's also a lot of progressive Hindus coming up, especially from the younger generation. And that is very promising.
Thank you so much for sharing, Sharanta. I think that that point is really important, that, you know, there are, it's not just individuals, but there is, you know, a rising movement against Hindutva, whether it's in Holland or the US or any of these countries. Sravya, do you want to close it off?
Yeah, so I think that in the US, actually, we often overstate the impact of Hindutva organizations. I think that probably the greatest impact that some of these organizations have had is influencing the general tenor of South Asia foreign policy. So for a long time, the only Hindu American groups or Indian American groups kind of oriented themselves in this pro-Modi, pro-BJP way. And so that was the only voice that like the Committee on Foreign Policy in the Senate and House heard, or the State Department heard. That's changing now. And people are also just a lot more aware of the atrocities happening in India. But for a long time, that was the case. So that allowed things like Pramila Jayapal's legislation speaking out against the oppression of Muslims in Kashmir, that allowed that resolution to be shut down. That being said, I do think that Hindutva groups are losing influence, and that is because a lot of these groups have taken a very hard right turn since Modi's re-election. Before that, most of these groups were, in my opinion, quite moderate in the sense that they tended to keep any right-wing views they had very like under the radar. But since Modi got reelected, they have been empowered to say, you know, support really Islamophobic legislation, advocate for it loudly, do frankly, you know, ridiculous posturing out in the public. And I think it's the job of, you know, Hindu progressives to recognize that and also, you know, call it out. But I think that they're not fooling a lot of people. They don't have a lot of political support. You know, the two of the major Hindu members of Congress, Pramila Jayapal and Rohit Khanna, have been very outspoken against Hindu nationalism. I think younger Hindus in the United States are increasingly aware of the dangers of right-wing politics and are turning away from it. I think that a lot of the Indian American community isn't necessarily like, they're kind of agnostic, like they're not taking a strong stance against it, but they're not for it either. They kind of feel averse to the whole thing. So I think that they like to say that, oh, we're representing Hindus and, you know, Hindus believe all these things. And I don't necessarily think that's true. There was also a study, and Nikhil, you might have the exact numbers, like Indian Americans in the US, like a lot of them are concerned that this is a threat, from Carnegie. Do you want to talk about that a bit?
Yeah, the Carnegie Endowment, which is a think tank in DC, they did this survey last year of Indian Americans. And they found that the majority, so 53% of all Indian Americans, believe that Hindutva is a threat to India's democracy and minorities. And among Indian American Hindus, 40% of them believe that Hindutva is a threat. So it's not like a fringe kind of opinion here. We're talking about almost half of the Hindu population, which is really worried about what's going on.
And when you say that number, I think it's important to recognize that there's a large, like, it's not like 60% are pro-Hindutva. It's like there's a lot of people who are kind of in the middle, like, you know, so I think that's just important to note.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sravya. And I think your points lead us really well into the final question. And so we have about 10 minutes before we'll go into Q&A. And I want to conclude with asking you all, why is it important that Hindus in the diaspora speak up against Hindutva? And what would your message be to a young Hindu in the diaspora who's upset by all this Islamophobia and casteism and xenophobia that's being expressed in their homes or temples or communities? You know, what would your message be, and why is it important for us to speak as Hindus against Hindutva?
Well, if you look at the message of Hinduism, the motto of the South African Hindu Mahasabha is Vasudev Kutumbakam, the world is one family. And if you start from that basis, it's not possible to discriminate against anyone, whether it's of a faith group, sexual orientation, gender, race, caste, class, whatever it is. So technically, the ideal situation. One of the issues in South Africa is they are challenging. Our focus has been a scripturally based Hinduism. So in a scripturally based Hinduism, there's no Hindutva. That's where I would see it. So the space for them to come in is very, very difficult, etc. So if we want to educate the new generation, obviously we should be fired by idealism. As in all faith sectors, create a better world. Are we going to be apathetic and say Corona is going to wipe all of us out and let's wait for it and it'll be the end? Or we say we want to challenge, we want to create a better world is possible, and that we're going to be part of that. We're going to be creating something. I teach for a living, so obviously I influence a lot of young people, or try to influence them. Like most of you fall in the age group of the generation of my students and my son, who is a postgraduate student. So we have to believe that an alternate reality is possible, that a better world is possible, a world that's free from prejudice and discrimination and inequality, all of those things that all faiths push against, at least from a scriptural point of view. I just want to make a point that generally Hindutva is weak in the indentured societies. That's my overview, because I do some diaspora work. So whether it's Suriname or Guyana or Trinidad or Tobago or Mauritius or Fiji or Malaysia, and that's for several reasons, because of the disconnect as I think I forgot my colleague from Holland our colleague friend from Holland was saying, the NRIs, the non-resident Indians, even in South Africa, the new arrivals from India, the software guys and all of those people who are in demand for jobs, they look down upon us. That's the reality. They discriminate between the indentured and the descendants. They are seen to be higher and superior. I'll make one more comparative point for my colleague from Holland and Suriname. Munshi Rehman Khan in Suriname, he was a Maulana. When he went to Suriname, he found people didn't know the Ramayana. So he used to read the Ramayana. And there's a very interesting story, which is, I think much has been written about this. And someone called Mohan Gautam, a professor from Leiden, is retired. He's actually been tracing the history of this, important kind of leader. I mean, in an age where we are trying to spread disinformation and attack other faiths, you are seeing a Muslim introducing a Hindu scripture in Suriname. I think that's something needs a lot more, that information needs publicity, needs circulation to show that we all have certain shared histories, etc. We share our festivals, whether it's, I think Eid is coming up in the next few days, the Diwali festivals, all things with sharing and caring. It's not about, separation, division, and hatred. And I think hate is we all know hatred is very, very dangerous. Those of you located in Europe, I'm sure you've always, we always come back to the Nazis and what happened and how we need to ensure that another era of that type of hatred does not care. And the last part, globally, the only savior for the world, I think, is linked to what Nikhil and his colleagues are involved in. We are trying, why are we promoting human rights? Because everything else has failed. in a neoliberal world, etc., we are saying if we promote a human rights agenda, it's going to be a fairer world, a safer world, where there's be less discrimination, less prejudice, and that's what we have to do. Thank you.
Thank you, Bridget. Our rest of the panelists, just a couple minutes each on, why should diaspora Hindus be speaking out against Hindutva?
I think diaspora Hindus have, because we come from such diverse communities and we've had the opportunity to define Hinduism outside of Indian identity, we have a really good chance at reshaping what Hinduism means. And that reshaping of what Hinduism means, I think, is really integral to challenging this idea that India should be a Hindu state or India is a Hindu state. And, Indians have, in at least in the US, tend to have a lot of, money and resources. And to be able to kind of use that, redistribute that to help folks in India who are more marginalized, I think is really, really important. And that requires challenging existing ideologies about caste, about Hindu nationalism, about Muslims, about class in India. And second, in terms of, I think you asked a question about how you would talk to someone who is Hindu nationalist, is, believes in caste or is Islamophobic, etc. And this is something I've been thinking about a lot. And I'm not very good at it yet. I'm still very hot-headed and, like to end conversations when I'm uncomfortable. But I think that there's been a lot of discourse about how you talk to people who disagree with you. And one of the best things is to kind of understand where they're coming from and where that perspective is coming from, and asking them questions and then trying to bring up your own perspective without outright judging them off the bat. Like at least in my experience, when I've talked to people who are Hindu nationalists, they are often from families who have been affected by the partition. And that doesn't excuse their discrimination or bias or anything, but that comes from a place of trauma, right? So if someone says, I don't believe that Muslims should have a place in India, like India is a Hindu state, where do you get that idea from? Oh, well, my family, they were kicked out of Pakistan, like the Muslims, like they hurt our family, etc. You can say, that's really difficult. I'm really sorry your family had to go through that. I also believe that no family who's Muslim in India should have to go through that as well, right? So that's how you can start a dialogue where it's not coming from a place of judgment, but it's coming from a place of understanding, and you're trying to build a bridge. And you may not convince anybody, but at least you're opening that door for the conversation to happen. And I think another part of that is remembering that material change is sometimes more valuable than convincing your elderly grandma that in certain things, right? Like I think sometimes we focus a little bit too much on like the family friends conversation without thinking, okay, what impact is this having in the diaspora? And I think looking at temples, looking at organizations and institutions is also really powerful. And I think both are important, but it's also important to look at institutional change as well, not just the personal relationship change.
Yeah, absolutely. The question of, funding and actual material resources being sent to different groups and stuff is very, very important. And we at the same time need to be having conversations and discussions. So thank you so much, Shravya. Sarantala?
Yes. Well, I noticed that most Hindus here in the West, they are only concerned about the Hindu victims in Pakistan and in Bangladesh. But I think that the Hindus here, they should also raise awareness for the victims in India, not just Hindus, I mean religious minorities, because we have to realize that an attack on any minority in India, it is also an attack on us. It is an attack on our faith. So I don't mean just the Hindu victims, it attack on Muslims, on Christians, Sikh, Dalits, anyone, any minority. It is also an attack on us because Modi and his supporters, the Sanghis, they are using our religion to oppress others. So we should all be concerned on what is happening in India. And I think that one of the things that we could use is not just talking with other Hindus, starting a dialogues, which I think is a good idea, what Shravya supposed, but I think that we also should collaborate on social media. If I look Yeah, for instance, Islamic friends of mine, whenever there is an attack, for instance, the attack in Paris or any other extremist attack, I see many Muslim friends of mine, they condemn it. They are like, this is not my Islam, this is not my faith. This violence does not belong to us. And I think that we can use that as an example. Maybe we cannot change what is happening in India, but we can on social media and to other people tell that all the violence in India and hate speech, that does not belong to us. It is not in our name. And we Hindus, we support every minority that is being oppressed in India, and people here all over the world, they should know about our support.
Thank you so much. And Yagisha, you want to close this up?
Yeah, I can close it up. I think everyone has basically covered, why it's important that Hindus in the diaspora should speak up. We all have the same reasons, but in terms of what my message to a young Hindu who was upset by all of this would be, maybe I can answer that question in a way that I'm looking at the Q&A chat and there's somebody who would like a bit of an explanation on what Hindutva or Hindu nationalism is. So how long do we have? I don't want to go over time.
Go ahead. We can go for maybe like 2 minutes and then we'll go to Arjun's video.
Okay, cool. So, I mean, I mentioned this before, but like, or I don't know if I did, but Hindu nationalism hasn't always been this popular, right? Like if RSS has literally been banned in India, like more than once in the past. So from what I know of Hindu nationalism, it seems like it really emerged into legitimacy in the 1990s, which was around the same time when social nets were being cut, the economy was being a lot more liberalized, and it's also the exact same time when farmer suicides were really, really taking off. Like that's when the issue was really blowing up. And in that decade, the number is something like some 300,000 farmers committed suicide. I mean, I think that's the official number because the debt that they were in was so inescapable, right? So I don't think it's a coincidence that all of those things line up, right? In terms of time, I think the cultural project of Hindu nationalism was only really able to get this sort of hold of India and the Indian population in this period because of the deep brutalization people were facing. And because that delegitimized sort of like the status quo, which was the Congress, the centrists, right? So it may be that because the BJP, just like the Congress, allows for such barbaric levels of brutalization of working people, it weaponizes religious identity to distinguish itself from the Congress in order to sell itself to the voter market as different from the Congress. That's the trademark is hateful politics, right? And it's a significant difference. But so that like it's a significant difference that the hateful politics, and that's what they identify as being a nationalist, as it's what it means to be proud to be a Hindu. But when the most basic needs of the masses remain unmet, like we're seeing with these farmers, I mean this is the largest strike recorded in world history. It's the most significant resistance to Hindutva that we've seen in our lifetime. So I mean, we should be drawing an incredible amount of inspiration from this, because if we want to battle Hindutva, that's where we got to be looking. And so that's what, I mean, I have learned from this, that when the most basic needs of the masses are unmet and centrists are not able to offer any real explanations or solutions, that leaves a real void for the Hindu nationalist project to come in and invent a fictitious problem. Hindus are threatened by Muslims, and it's able to sell itself as a solution to this fictitious problem. And then they don't have to deal with the real problem, poverty. Farmers are committing suicide. Farmers are striking and dying on the streets, caste. So I've come to think that's how it's taken over the country, and the previous status quo has been completely displaced. Small elites at the top are using the views of the vast majority to cement a Hindu bloc without class divisions and contradictions and struggle. So based on that sort of understanding, I would say that the cultural and ideological project of Hindutva comes out of the material conditions of people, the suffering of the working people of India. So our discussions, analysis, and our resistance as anti-Hindutva Hindus needs to tie the hateful cultural project of Hindutva, the co-option of the religion, to the practical and material conditions from which it emerges. And just to add quickly, I, like any other anti-Hindutva Hindu, have had multiple very dreadful, heated arguments at the dining table with Hindutva supporters in my own family. And I don't know if any of had any real success with that, but I don't think that approach works so much. I mean, at least it hasn't in my experience. And the thing is that even if it did work, even if I did change someone's mind, I don't think that the resistance to Hindutva can be approached in such an individualistic way. I think it's got to be much more cultural and strategic, looking at Kerala for that.
Thanks, Vagisha. Yeah, I think the points of so many problems stemming out of Hindutva are so interconnected, and it's economic and it's political and social and religious. So thank you so much for that reminder. At this point, we will just hear a few closing reflections from Arjun, our speaker from Australia, and then we'll have about 10-15 minutes for Q&A. So that should take us to 2:15 Eastern time. So I will just play the 3-minute clip from Arjun's video in 1 second. Okay, can someone just unmute themselves and say that this is up and going? Can you see the video?
We can see it, yeah.
Yeah, okay, great.
It is through the settling, socializing process of the agricultural civilization that the demonization of the other gets embedded into the social being. In every story, a demon or Rakshas appears. You can imagine agricultural villages huddled together, fearing the darkness beyond, fearing the tribal demons of the forest. In Kathakali, every performance ends with the killing of a demon as a sacrificial offering to the holy fire of performance. The Mahabharata has the demonic other within the family, the core of cousins, and the Ramayana has the demon without, the king of Lanka. This othering and demonization gets further enhanced over the centuries with the formalizing of the caste structure of the social order, with the other becoming a perpetual site for contempt. In defending the great wisdom of Hindu texts and the great beauty of its embodied practices, we cannot not deal with the embedded fear and demonization of the other. This is the historic challenge we are faced with, to resist the Godse principle, who wanted the Hindu state to be hard towards the enemy, or instead to embrace an older form of gentleness within the private and the public self. To be ourselves, to be a sovereign, independent people, we don't need to demonize and other the Christian, the Muslim, the Parsi, and the Sikh. It is important then to recognize in the Hindu self the ancient fear of the demonic other, especially in these conditions of globalization, when you, the Hindu male, will be thrown into all kinds of other worlds. It is important to embrace the other within yourself and not fear and demonize the other. These philosophical musings are, of course, almost ridiculous in contrast to the terrible reality India is facing even as I speak. That there has been criminal neglect at the highest levels of power, there is no doubt. Those in power today must be made accountable once the dust settles. I live close to the Delhi airport. Last night, the planes were relentless with the sound. The sky was relentless with the sound of planes arriving. They were bringing American help, I imagine, PPE kits, oxygen compressors, and other much needed but petty aid. All this while 20,000 crores is being spent on decolonizing the facade of Indian power and giving it a hard Hindu look. We must resist and fight this hardness at all costs. In the meantime, be kind, be gentle, and be safe.
So I think that reflection from Arjun really encapsulates a lot and reminds us of the stakes right now of sort of what this ideology, when it's in power, what it's capable of doing to a people, and the also this point of this fear of the other, which is so deeply embedded in aspects of our traditions and practices, when that's turned into real policies and hatred against Muslims and Christians and Dalits becomes part of, a state governing itself, what does that really look like? And I think we're seeing all of these effects on the ground, and the stakes are as high as they can be for us to really start speaking up. So we do have about 10-15 minutes for Q&A, and there are quite a few questions from our participants. So I think we can start with a question from Joey Richards, going back to sort of how Hindutva is manifesting itself in these different countries. Have any of the panelists witnessed Hindutva appearing in popular culture or entertainment in their country, in the world of TV, literature, films, comedy, something like that? Anyone can take a stab at it.
So this was interesting to me. So I don't know if you've all seen the show Never Have I Ever, but there's this one, it's Mindy Kaling's new show, and it's about like an Indian American teenager, and in their third episode, they go to Ganesh Puja, and there's a strange line where the mom in the show says something like, they're taking the priest home or something, and then he's like, oh, I could have taken an Uber, and he's like, our priest in Uber, Prime Minister Modi on Postmates, that's ridiculous. And I remember hearing that and being like, oh, really? Is this a Modi supporting family? Do we really have to have that right now? And I don't know if that actually comes from a place of Hindutva. I kind of think it just comes from a place of ignorance and just thinking, oh, Modi's the prime minister, I'm just going to put this funny joke in. But I think that just really shows that a lot of Hindus in the diaspora don't know anything about Hindutva or what's happening in India, especially like my generation, so people born and brought up here. And that just means that there needs to be a lot more education about this.
Thanks, Ravia. Any other panelists have a story of how Hindutva is coming into popular culture?
In Bollywood, but maybe the person who asked the question means the local. Does he mean the local media or also Bollywood?
I think it could be open to, but I think mostly local, but if there are any examples you want to share from Bollywood too.
Yeah, I do see a lot of examples in Bollywood, because I just hate the narrative of Hindus always being the victim of the Muslim invaders and anything that is related to Islam. So yes, you can see since Modi came to power, there are a lot of Bollywood movies with a lot of influence from his nationalism. And I think that it also contributes to the Hindu victimhood. Hindus are always the victim. We are always innocent. We can never be an extremist. It is always the fault of the other people of the other religions. And that just sets the narrative that is a very dangerous way of thinking. Yes, that was my example.
Thank you, Shantala. Another question that's come up is asked by Param Patel, and this is something that we were talking about as a group as well, as how do you communicate with your friends who support Hindutva and the reality, seeing the reality of the situation at hand, and particularly, how do you counter this idea that speaking up against Hindutva is anti-India or anti-Hindu? Because I think that's a common critique that many of us are hit with. So how do you kind of react to that?
So I just wrote sorry, Bridge, go ahead.
No, you go for it, go.
So I just read an article about this issue in American Kahani, about specifically how a lot of things get called anti-Hindu when they're not anti-Hindu. I think that the experience of, I think that there is anti-Hindu bias in the diaspora, like people experiencing people, like for me, I grew up in a rural area, very Christian, like people would always try to convert me. Teachers didn't represent my religion very well in the classroom. I tried to start a Hindu student association at my club, and we couldn't because people thought we were they basically didn't understand Hinduism. They thought we were some cult. So that exists, racism against Indians exists. Like my friend, he lives in an even more rural part than me. And he just texted me yesterday saying that someone put an IED in his backyard, so they had to call a bomb squad, and they get threats all the time because of their race, right? So that experience is real, but a lot of people are using the idea of this anti-Hindu bias and racism against Indians to justify things like any criticism of India or any criticism of Hindu nationalism or any criticism of Hinduism or reinterpretation of Hindu texts is Hindu-phobic. And that's not true. None of that precludes your ability to practice your religion or live freely as a Hindu or Indian person in the diaspora. People are fighting against anti-caste resolutions saying that they're anti-Hindu. So either they are Hindus who very strongly believe in caste, but there's no reason, those aren't anti-Hindu, those are anti-caste, right? If you're one of those people who believes in that. And then the third thing is, right, this idea that speaking against Hindu nationalism is anti-Hindu. I come from a place where I think that I believe in pluralism and the idea that Hinduism is supposed to be a religion that respects all religions as true, and a religion where we believe every single human being is divine. So for me, speaking up against the oppression of Muslims in Kashmir, the Citizenship Amendment Act, this legislation against farmers, that to me is incredibly Hindu, because it is actively acting on the fact that we need to believe in the fact that all human beings are divine, no matter what faith they practice, and no one should be oppressed by these terribly dehumanizing and violent laws. So that's what I'll say.
Thank you so much, Rabia. Bridji, I think you're...
Yeah, I was going to say from personal experience, where the attack on me was, how can you be a Hindu leader? Because I'm not Hindu, that's I said it's a small group, but they got this. You see, social media can obviously be abused in different ways. So they operate largely in social media, groups and chat groups. And I basically don't exist. And I also on Facebook blocked all of them because I really couldn't put up with the trolls, etc. And I think the big issue, sometimes as Hindus, we try to be apolitical. I must be self-reflectively critical as well. So we got problems in South Africa. There's a lot of corruption. The government is under pressure. There's high levels of crime, etc. There's xenophobia. And I always say, once you get rid of the Zimbabweans and the Nigerians and the Ethiopians and Congolese, etc., who's left after that? You can look at the Indian, the other, and sometimes the Indians of Hindu and Muslim faith, we tend to retreat into our cultural and religious cocoons. And the case of East Africa and especially Uganda is, I think, quite well known what happened there. So it's very important that we engage with the mainstream society wherever we are located. If you look at Fiji, there are political problems in Fiji. If you look at Trinidad, there are political problems in Trinidad, etc. And there's a conflation of faith and religion. But what comes from India is the notion that being critical of India means you're not a Hindu, and that's really what we have to dispel. And in my view, and I get criticized for this view, it's if you quote your scripture, then there's no Hindutva in our scripture. It's very important. We get criticized for that. For in South Africa, we have got a fairly uniform priest curriculum. I said fairly; it's not all where it should be, but we are improving quite a bit. And we've got an organization for priests, for example, because they're the most powerful figures in our faith. They can influence. They can also be easily influenced. And certainly there are, as my colleague from Suriname was saying, some of the priests from India, they do come and try to influence, politics. And because they're in a minority and we try to monitor them, it's not been that successful. But I think, just to summarize it, I think politics is important. Politics of where we are located and the politics that gets imported.
Thank you so much, Bridji. We're just coming up to the end of our time now. I know that there are a few more questions. Very sorry that we weren't able to get to all of them, but want to thank all of our panelists again for bringing their experiences and to being very, very honest and open about sort of what our communities are facing right now and the type of conversations and the hate that's being spread, but also the ways in which people are pushing back. And I think it's more important than ever that we keep having these kind of conversations globally, keeping in mind all of the different tensions that Bridji and Shakuntal brought up between, different parts of the diaspora. NRI is discriminating against members of the indentured diaspora. The casteism that we know is alive and well in many parts of our community. And the hope is that we can keep building this Hindu movement against Hindutva, against oppression and caste. I want to just give one of our panelists, if anyone has a very, very final closing thought that they'd like to share. Otherwise, we can wrap it up. No, everyone is satisfied and has gotten their point across. Then I will pass it on back to our host, Elena.
Thank you very much. I am incredibly grateful that this last event of the EU-India People's Summit has been so much more than just EU-India politics laying out some roadmap, but has really been about this common vision of humanity. And the official government summit happened today, right? And they published a 6-page document in which they have set out their goals for the next year until they meet again next year. And that document, of course, is pretty much the same that they already wrote last year. We didn't expect much, but it does start with this statement of common humanity and shared values. And that has become a catchphrase, and it's important to pin that down as we have done here. What do we mean by common values and humanity? And how do we shift this back onto the main stage? And that is a beautiful note to end this 8-day summit on. It has been 8 days. I think we're at over 40 events. We had over, including you guys, over 80 speakers, and have really pinned down this vision that we have, and have like fleshed it out a little, carved it out, the nuances. So on that note, I am closing this session and also the 8-day EU-India People's Summit. And I'm not only grateful for the people who are here today, but to everybody who has made this summit possible and who has participated in whatever capacity. Seriously, the biggest gratitude from my behalf. So thank you. And I wish everybody a wonderful day, night, week, until we meet again.
Thank you so much, Elena.